From the beginning of recorded history, and for thousands upon thousands of years, cultures across the entire world all believed the earth was flat. Their various cosmologies and cosmogonies differed in slight ways, but their overall geographies and astronomies were incredibly consistent and in fact virtually identical. The earth was a stationary plane, void of any motion or curvature, flat across its entire expanse, except of course for hills, mountains, and valleys. The North Pole was the magnetic monopole center point of the flat Earth, with Polaris, the North Pole star, situated directly above. Polaris was the only motionless star in the heavens, with all the other constellations revolving perfect circles over the Earth every night. The stars were divided into two categories, known as the fixed stars and the wandering stars. The fixed stars were so called because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to stay fixed in their constellation patterns, night after night, year after year, century after century, never changing their relative positions. The wandering stars, what are today referred to as planets, were so called because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to wander the heavens, taking their own unique spirograph-like patterns, making both forward and retrograde motions over and around the Earth during their cycles. The sun and moon were both of equal size, and they too revolved over and around the motionless Earth, as immortalized in the Chinese yin-yang symbol. The sun and moon were much closer to Earth than supposed nowadays, and each shined with their own unique opposite lights, the sun's being warm, golden, drying, preservative, and antiseptic, and the moon's light being cold, silver, damp, putrefying, and septic. The sun and moon, as though connected to a magnetic maypole, made alternating spiral journeys over and around the Earth every year. The sun began its journey at the Tropic of Capricorn at the winter solstice, where it made its fastest and largest circle over the Earth. For the next 3 months, every day the sun slightly narrowed its path and slowed its speed until by the spring equinox the sun had spiraled its way from the Tropic of Capricorn to the equator. Then for the next 3 months, again every day, the sun continued to slightly narrow its path and slow its speed until the summer solstice, when the sun made its smallest, slowest circle around the Tropic of Cancer. Once the sun reached this innermost circle, like the ribbons and dancers around the maypole, the sun would then begin its opposing, widening, quickening journey back to the Tropic of Capricorn. For the next 3 months, every day the sun slightly widened its path and hastened its speed until the autumnal equinox, the sun had spiraled its way from the Tropic of Cancer back to the equator. Then for the next 3 months again, every day the sun continued to slightly widen its path and hasten its speed until the winter solstice, when the sun made its largest, fastest circle around the Tropic of Capricorn, and the annual journey began again. The moon had a similar yearly path revolving over and around the Earth, but unlike the sun, which constantly changed its speed to keep a consistent 24-hour day, the moon's speed never changed, so depending on its latitude, the moon was observed then, as we can observe today, to take approximately 24.7 to 25 hours per cycle. This is why at different times and places during each month we can see the moon in the morning, afternoon, or night. This is also the origin of old fairy tales such as The Hare and the Hedgehog, or The Tortoise and the Hare. The hare, like the sun, begins the annual race full of energy, excitement, and ego, declaring himself the definite winner, and gets off to an immediate head start. Meanwhile, equally confident in his seemingly lesser abilities, the humble, slow, and steady tortoise moon begins as well, allowing the hare to lead. As the race carries on, the cocky hare tires and slows down, or takes a nap, at which point the tortoise overtakes him. This is analogous to the moon reaching the Tropic of Cancer before the sun each year and beginning its return journey. When the hare reaches the halfway point of the race, he realizes his lackluster attitude has resulted in being overtaken by the slower tortoise, and begins to speed up again. Then, for the remainder of the race, the sun picks up speed day by day, gaining on the moon, but ultimately losing as the slow and steady tortoise reaches the finish line before the hare and wins. So for ancient man, Earth and Polaris were the two immovable center points of the universe, around which the sun, moon, and other stars all revolved in a dome-like shape. Some cultures believed in a literal, physical, solid dome or firmament to which the fixed stars were bound. Other cultures mythologized the axis mundi as the world tree with Polaris at the center and all the other constellations forming the branches. In these flat Earth depictions, the North Pole occupied the center point, and south was all straight lines extending outwards from there. East and west were not straight lines, as is assumed nowadays, but were in fact circles, just like all lines of latitude and the paths of the celestial bodies. The southern circumference of Earth was surrounded by a gigantic wall of ice 150 to 200 feet above sea level, holding the interconnected oceans in like a World Cup. Beyond the ice wall, some cultures claimed a firm barrier existed through which no human could penetrate. Other cultures believed there were entire worlds and other civilizations existing beyond the Antarctic ice. Currently, and for the past half-century, there has existed an international Antarctic treaty preventing all independent exploration of Antarctica. Pre-approved guided tours exist which take visitors to a few coastal regions of Antarctica, but no independent exploration of the continent is allowed. Sailors like Jarl Andhoy have been caught attempting to explore Antarctica and threatened, turned around at gunpoint, fined, and jailed for violating this militarily enforced international treaty. As a result, the public currently has no way to confirm or deny the seemingly fantastical claims of ancient man concerning what may or may not exist at the southernmost extremities of the Earth. We can, however, confirm that this 200-foot ice wall surrounding the southern circumference of the Earth most certainly exists. We can confirm that Polaris is indeed the only non-moving star in the sky. All the fixed stars indeed rotate perfect circles around Polaris while remaining stuck in their relative constellations night after night, year after year, century after century. The wandering stars, or planets, do indeed wander the heavens, taking their own unique spirograph-like paths when charted from a geocentric perspective. The sun and moon are indeed observably of equal size and revolve over and around us in daily cycles. Just as the ancients observed, the sun's annual path does indeed travel from the Tropic of Capricorn at the winter solstice, to the equator at spring equinox, to the Tropic of Cancer at the summer solstice, back to the equator at autumnal equinox, and finally back to the Tropic of Cancer at winter solstice. The sun's light is indeed warm, golden, drying, preservative, and antiseptic, while the moon's light is indeed cold, silver, damp, putrefying, and septic. A thermometer placed in the sun's light will always read warmer than a thermometer placed in the sun's shade, while a thermometer placed in the moon's light will always read cooler than a thermometer placed in the moon's shade. Plant and animal substances exposed to sunlight quickly dry, shrink, coagulate, and lose their tendency to decompose and putrefy, whereas plant and animal substances exposed to moonlight will quickly show symptoms of putrefaction and decay. Last but not least, just as the ancients espoused, the Earth is observably motionless to all our senses, and the horizon remains perfectly flat as far as the eye can see. Not only does the horizon remain perfectly flat 360 degrees around the observer, but whether at sea level, the top of Mount Everest, 35,000 feet high in an airplane, or even at over 100,000 feet high, the highest any amateur hot air balloon has ever flown, the flat horizon actually rises to the eye level of the observer all the way up. On a globular Earth, no matter how large it is assumed to be, the horizon would remain where it was, and the rising observer would have to tilt his head downwards further and further the higher they rose to see the steadily falling horizon. Many people will be shocked to know that to this day every single scientific experiment ever devised to show the alleged motion of the Earth has failed to do so, or, given evidence of the opposite, that the Earth is indeed motionless, and every attempt ever made to measure the alleged curvature of the Earth has failed to do so, or, given evidence of the opposite, that the Earth is indeed flat. The first person in recorded history to ever claim that Earth was anything but the flat, motionless center of the universe was a Greek mathematician and philosopher named Pythagoras of Samos around 500 BC. Interestingly enough, Pythagoras has also been touted by Freemasonic historians such as Albert Mackey, James Anderson, William Hutchinson, and William Preston as being the very first Freemason. Presented more as a thought experiment than a complete cosmology, Pythagoras posited that if the Earth were a spherical globe turning on its vertical axis once per day while revolving annually around a stationary sun, that this model could also equally explain the cyclical motions of the heavenly bodies. This heliocentric model was taught to initiates at Pythagoras's Crotona school, but never became popular or had an influence outside of Greece for another 2,000 years. A century later, another Greek mathematician and philosopher named Plato also espoused a spherical Earth cosmology, except he claimed the Earth globe to be the motionless center of the universe, with the sun, moon, and stars revolving around. His most famous student, Aristotle, also wrote about this geocentric globe-Earth cosmology in his book On the Heavens, offering 3 main points of evidence for his theory. Firstly, Aristotle noted that when sailing away from an observer on shore, ships approaching the horizon disappeared from view hull before masthead, and he postulated that this occurrence was due to the curvature of the Earth. Aristotle argued that the hull disappeared first because beyond the horizon the globe Earth curved downwards, causing the hull and eventually the masthead and entire ship to drop below the curvature. Today, we can easily prove that Aristotle was incorrect in his assumption by using telescopes, binoculars, and zoom cameras. Once a ship has completely disappeared beyond the horizon, modern technology allows us to zoom in and bring the entire vessel, hull and all, back into full view. This proves that ships do not disappear hull first due to the alleged curvature of the Earth, and that the horizon line is in fact merely the vanishing point of perspective from a given observer's point of view, and not, as Aristotle supposed, the beginning of the Earth's curvature. The horizon is subjective, and varies in distance depending on the weather, the observer's height, and the strength of his eyesight or instruments. As noted previously, the horizon actually rises to the eye of the observer no matter how high he climbs, which also proves that the horizon line is not some objective point of curvature on a convex Earth, but rather the subjective vanishing point of perspective from a given observer's point of view. Aristotle's second point of evidence offered for his spherical Earth theory was the Earth's round shadow cast on the moon during lunar eclipses. To this day, heliocentrists still offer this argument as proof of a spherical Earth, claiming that during lunar eclipses, the Sun, Earth, and Moon align in a perfect 180-degree syzygy like 3 billiard balls, causing the Sun to cast the Earth's shadow onto the Moon. This clever but faulty assumption is rendered completely invalid, however, due to the fact that lunar eclipses have happened and continue to happen regularly when both the Sun and Moon are still visible together above the horizon. As early as the time of Pliny the Elder, there are records of eclipses happening while both the Sun and Moon were visible in the sky, and continue to be recorded by the Royal Astronomical Society today. Obviously, if the Sun and Moon are both observable simultaneously during an eclipse, then they are not aligned in a 180-degree syzygy, and it is therefore impossible that the Sun could be casting Earth's shadow on the Moon, and some other explanation must be sought. Another explanation, in fact, already existed in many cultures around the world, who posited that a third celestial body known as Rahu, or the Black Sun, also existed, equal in size to the Sun and Moon. This translucent dark body passed affront the Sun and Moon during solar and lunar eclipses, causing their lights to dim. Aristotle's final point of evidence offered for his spherical Earth theory was the appearance of Polaris and other stars to gradually decline overhead as an observer travels southwards. He argued that the gradual declination and eventual disappearance beyond the horizon of certain stars and constellations as one traveled southwards was evidence that the observer was traveling over a convex curved surface. Similar to the ships disappearing over the horizon argument, Aristotle posited that the horizon line was the literal curvature of his spherical Earth, and the stars which declined and disappeared beyond it became invisible because a mass of curved Earth existed between them and the observer. In actual fact, however, the gradual declination of objects in the sky towards the horizon is merely a product of the law of perspective on plane surfaces. As any art student of point perspective knows, the human eye views the world in a pyramidal shape, so that when looking down a long hallway, the floor appears to rise, the ceiling appears to sink, and the walls appear to narrow into a point at the center of the observer's view. Of course, the dimensions of the hallway remain constant for its entire length. The floor does not actually rise, the ceiling does not actually sink, nor do the walls actually close in. But to the human eye, everything is perceived this way. Similarly, when the sun, moon, airplanes, or clouds appear to sink towards the horizon as they move away from us, they are not actually losing altitude and slowly approaching sea level. They are in fact maintaining the same altitude, except they are moving away from you, and so the law of perspective makes them appear to sink. A century after Aristotle, around 250 BC, yet another Greek mathematician and philosopher named Eratosthenes made his claim to fame with a new alleged proof of the spherical earth. Eratosthenes noted that at noon during the summer solstice at Segue, the sun cast no shadow and the rays could reach straight to the bottom of his well, yet meanwhile in Alexandria, a vertically standing metal rod cast a significant shadow. By factoring the length of the shadow with his assumed distance to the sun, Eratosthenes recorded a measurement of Earth's circumference close to what heliocentrist astronomers still use today. The fact of the matter is, however, that Eratosthenes' calculations were made assuming the sun to be millions of miles away, so that its rays would fall perfectly parallel even in points as divergent as Segue and Alexandria. This faulty premise led to his faulty conclusion, which was eventually exposed upon the invention of the nautical sextant. Using sextants and plane trigonometry, by measuring the sun's angle at 2 points on Earth simultaneously and factoring their distance from each other, the Pythagorean theorem reveals both the height and dimensions of the sun. Using this method, the sun and moon have repeatedly been calculated to be approximately 32 miles in diameter, 3,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. High-altitude balloon footage has also filmed lighting hotspots on clouds, proving the sun to be local and acting as a spotlight, and not a burning ball of gas millions of miles away, as supposed by heliocentrists. After Eratosthenes, the globe Earth theory completely disappeared from philosophical thought and recorded history for almost 2 millennia. Geocentric flat Earth cosmologies continued to reign supreme, with even Eratosthenes himself, touted as the father of geography, depicting the Earth as flat in his famous 194 BC map of the world. Crates of Malice invented the first model globe Earth around this time as well, but it failed to have any effect on the world at large. Fast forward to 1522 AD, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan became the first person in known history to successfully sail around the world. This circumnavigation of Earth soon became and continues to be touted today as absolute proof of the spherical Earth theory. If Magellan was able to sail east to west around the entire world and return to his original starting point, surely the Earth cannot be flat and must be a globe, right? Wrong. Just as a compass can place its center point on a flat piece of paper, trace a circle either way around, and return to its original starting point, so can a ship or plane circumnavigate a flat Earth. The only kind of circumnavigation which could not happen on a flat Earth is north-southbound, which to this day has still never been done. Both the North Pole and Antarctica are military-enforced no-fly and no-sail zones due to restrictions originating from none other than the United Nations, the same United Nations that haughtily uses a flat Earth map in their official logo and flag. In 1543, just days before his death, Freemason and Jesuit Nicholas Copernicus published his book On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, which revived the old heliocentric cosmology of Pythagoras and began the so-called Copernican revolution away from a flat geocentric model and towards a global heliocentric model. Since his book claimed Earth to be a tilting, wobbling, spinning sphere revolving at breakneck speeds around a stationary sun, it was initially met with due incredulity. Copernicus always countered this by claiming his theories were merely hypotheses and shouldn't be considered truth. In his book he even wrote, quote, "The Pythagorean teaching was founded upon hypothesis, and it is not necessary that the hypothesis should be true, or even probable. The hypothesis of the movement of the Earth is only one which is useful to explain phenomena, but it should not be considered as an absolute truth. Contemporaries of Copernicus, such as Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, famously argued against his heliocentric model, positing that if the Earth revolved in an orbit around the Sun, the change in relative position of the stars after 6 months of orbital motion could not fail to be seen. Brahe wrote that the stars should seem to separate as we approach and come together as we recede. In actual fact, however, after millions of miles of supposed orbit around the Sun, not a single inch of parallax could be detected in the stars. As even Wikipedia notes, quote, "The lack of any observable parallax was considered a fatal flaw in any non-geocentric theory." Copernicus's answer to this obvious problem was simple. He moved the stars so ridiculously far away from the Earth that even after millions of miles of supposed orbit around the Sun, no appreciable parallax could be detected. Copernicus simply needed to claim that the stars were trillions upon trillions of miles away, so then, mathematically speaking, it would indeed be impossible to detect such slight parallax. Again, contemporaries of Copernicus argued against this convenient correction of his, arguing, quite rightly, that if the stars were trillions of miles away, then there is no way we could see them. Backpedaling once again, Copernicus claimed the reason we could still see stars trillions of miles away was because they were not mere tiny points of translucent light in the night sky, but that stars were in fact gigantic gas balls billions of times larger than our Sun. So first, Copernicus had to move the stars trillions of miles from Earth to explain away lack of parallax, and then he had to make the stars billions of times larger to account for why we should see them at all from such fantastical distances. Lastly, he offered very specific distances and mathematical equations to solidify his theory, claiming, for instance, that he had accurately calculated the Sun's distance from Earth to be exactly 3,391,200 miles. At the turn of the 17th century, Tycho Brahe, under the patronage of Emperor Rudolf II, began construction of the largest, most state-of-the-art astronomical observatory ever built. Upon hearing this, German astronomer and Freemason Johannes Kepler was determined to apprentice under Brahe. Even though Kepler championed Copernicus's widely disputed heliocentric globe-Earth theory, Brahe begrudgingly accepted Kepler as his apprentice based on his merit as an astute astronomer and mathematician. Brahe allowed Kepler access to the observatory, but guarded his data and findings from him completely, which frustrated and angered Kepler to the point of eventually culminating in a heated argument between the two of them, resulting in Brahe kicking Kepler out. After much amends and apologizing, a year later, Brahe finally forgave Kepler and accepted him back as apprentice. This time, however, Kepler was not content with his role as mere apprentice and soon proposed and secured a commissioned position on Brahe and Emperor Rudolph's new project, the Rudolphine Astronomical Tables. Less than a month later, Tycho Brahe mysteriously dropped dead, and Johannes Kepler was given access to all of Brahe's coveted data, free rein of the observatory, and became Emperor Rudolph's new official astronomer. Abundant circumstantial evidence and obvious motive have long fed speculation that Kepler actually murdered Brahe. Brahe was only 54 years old and in fine health when suddenly he became deathly ill and passed away. His official cause of death was reported as a bladder infection, but subsequent autopsies of his body revealed toxic quantities of mercury present on his mustache hairs, which has led many researchers to conclude he was poisoned. The 2004 book Heavenly Intrigue suggested that Kepler had indeed murdered Brahe to gain access to his data. Kepler himself never denied this, and he actually wrote, quote, "I confess that when Tycho died, I quickly took advantage of the absence, or lack of circumspection of the heirs, by taking the observations under my care, or perhaps usurping them." And so for the remainder of his life, Kepler worked at Brahe's observatory for Brahe's employer, using Brahe's data to further his Copernican theories, which Brahe had always criticized. He modified Copernicus's calculations of celestial motions, changing them from perfect circles to irregular ellipses, and even formulated a new, updated distance of the Sun from Earth. While Copernicus had claimed positively the Sun to be 3,391,200 miles from Earth, Kepler assured the astronomical community that his new figure of 12,376,800 miles was the true distance. A few years later, in 1608, the first telescope was invented, and by 1609, the next champion of Copernicism, Italian astronomer, Freemason, and probable Jesuit Galileo Galilei, had purchased and built several of them. Galileo improved upon the telescope's design, boosting the zoom capabilities from the original 3 times up to 30 times magnification, and in 1610 made the most important alleged discovery of his career. With his 30-times zoom telescope, Galileo claimed to have seen what he described as, quote, 3 fixed stars, totally invisible by their smallness, all close to Jupiter and lying on a straight line through it. After tracking these invisible stars for a while and noticing they appeared sometimes but not others, Galileo concluded that when he could not find them, they must be hiding behind Jupiter, and therefore they must not be invisible stars at all, but rather invisible moons orbiting Jupiter. His alleged discovery of moons orbiting Jupiter was then touted as proof of the Copernican system, claiming that Earth must be a planet like Jupiter since both have orbiting moons. To this day, NASA claims to have special telescopes, which can, on occasion, see these moons of Jupiter, just as Galileo claimed in his day to see, on occasion, with his special telescopes. Nowadays, with modern telescopes and zoom technology, we can see the celestial bodies far closer and with far more clarity than Galileo could have ever hoped for. A 2016 Nikon P900 has 83 times optical zoom and 332 times digital capabilities, which put Galilean telescopes to shame. Yet, even with this level of magnification, Galileo's alleged invisible stars orbiting Jupiter are nowhere to be found. Galileo and his fellow Mason predecessors, acting more like true believers of their heliocentric faith than legitimate scientists, were constantly guilty of inventing elaborate theories to support their foregone conclusion. This was never more evident than when Galileo presented his theory on the cause of tides in 1616. Cardinal Bellarmine had written Galileo the year before, stating that, quote, the Copernican system could not be defended without a true physical demonstration that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun. Taking this to heart, Galileo hoped to show that the earth's tides were caused by the sloshing back and forth of water as a point on earth's surface sped up and slowed down due to earth's alleged rotation on axis and revolution around the sun. He argued that these hypothetical motions of his globular earth were the cause of tides, and therefore the tides themselves were proof of Earth's motion. Unfortunately for Galileo, his ideas were not accepted and easily proven wrong by his contemporaries, who rightly pointed out that if his theory were correct, there would only be one high tide per day. Not only this, but if tides were caused by Earth's alleged motion, all lakes, ponds, and other inland bodies of water should be similarly affected, yet they are not. The next champion of heliocentricism was English mathematician and astronomer, knighted Freemason and Royal Society President Sir Isaac Newton. In 1687, Newton published his famous Principia Mathematica, which presented his idea of gravity to the world. The globe Earth theory had long faced criticism for being impractical due to the natural physics of spinning spherical objects, namely that anything placed on their surface should immediately fall or fly off. How could people, buildings, and the great oceans remain perfectly stuck to a ball Earth spinning faster than the speed of sound? The globe Earth theory needed a force that could keep everything in place somehow, a force strong enough to keep the oceans stuck to the Earth, but weak enough not to sink a sailboat, a force strong enough to drag the entire atmosphere along with Earth's breakneck speed, but weak enough to allow birds and bugs to travel freely and unabated in all directions. A force so strong it could make rain fall upwards and plants grow upside down, but yet so weak that it could not be detected by any contemporary methods. Newton's postulate of, quote, an invisible force able to act over vast distances led to him being heavily criticized for, quote, introducing occult agencies into the field of science. Previous to Newton's theory of universal gravitation, the natural laws of density and buoyancy already perfectly and adequately explained the world around us. For example, the reason a balloon filled with helium rises into the sky while a balloon filled with air drops to the ground is not because Newton's mystical pulling force has an aversion to helium, but rather simply because helium is lighter and less dense than the nitrogen, oxygen, and other elements which compose the air around it, so it floats up. And conversely, a balloon filled with your carbon dioxide exhalation is heavier and denser than the air around it, so it falls down to the ground. If you blow a dandelion seed out of your hands, a substance just barely heavier than the air, it will float away and slowly but eventually fall to the ground. If you drop an anvil from your hands, something much heavier than the air, it will quickly and directly fall straight to the ground. This is not because gravity prefers anvils to dandelion seeds, but rather because it is the natural physics of buoyancy for objects less dense than the medium surrounding them to rise, while objects denser than the medium surrounding them to sink. This is the reason raindrops fall down through the air and air bubbles rise up through the water, because of their relative densities. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the mystical pulling force of spinning balls from Newton's imagination. Newton's theory allegedly began when, upon seeing an apple fall from a tree at Woolsthorpe, as though no one in the history of humanity up to that point had ever seen a falling object and wondered why it fell, he had a veritable scientific epiphany. The apple fell not because it was heavier and denser than the air around it, but rather because a force at the center of the spinning ball earth pulled it to the ground. Newton quickly got to work formulating his theory of universal gravitation, which he used to explain not only falling objects, but also orbiting celestial bodies. Newton claimed that the sun, moon, earth, planets, and stars' gravity caused them to all orbit around the most massive nearby bodies. So not only was gravity fickle and selective about which objects it caused to fall and which it allowed to rise, gravity was also able to perform different functions on different scales. At the human scale, gravity allegedly caused people, buildings, and oceans to stick to the Earth, while at the planetary scale, gravity allegedly caused moons to orbit around planets, and planets to orbit around stars. Unfortunately, Newton never addressed this, but the question remains, how and why would gravity cause both planets to orbit the sun and people to stick to the Earth? Gravity should either cause people to float around in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth, Moon, and planets to all be pulled and crash into the Sun. The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both. Furthermore, this magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it. There is nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dust bunny to stick to or orbit around it. Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off, and nothing sticks to or orbits around it. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical evidential example is hearsay, not science. By now, however, you are likely beginning to see that these Freemasonic, heliocentric priests are less interested in science and truth than they are in propagating contrived evidences for their foregone conclusions. In like manner, as Copernicus had claimed positively the sun to be 3,391,200 miles away, and Kepler had calculated it to be positively 12,376,800 miles away, Newton was quoted as remarking, "It matters not whether we reckon it 28 or 54 million miles distant, for either would do just as well." It appears he was correct, because the alleged distance to the heliocentrist sun has continued to increase by the millions until today, where we stand with NASA's current official figure of 93 million miles.